On May 28, 2009, 11 crates were carried into Knapdale Forest. The animals inside had not breathed Scottish air for 400 years. The rivers waiting for them had been classified by the very scientists tasked with managing them as hydrologically degraded, modified beyond meaningful restoration by centuries of drainage, dredging, and agricultural runoff. 11 animals, no tools, no machinery, no government budget. What they built in the months that followed would outperform every flood mitigation intervention the Scottish government had funded in the preceding 3 decades. That sentence is worth sitting with. The data did not come from advocates or rewilding campaigners. It came from the University of Exeter's hydrology department, researchers who spent a decade placing automated flow gauges, turbidity sensors, and GPS tracking arrays across the Knapdale catchment. Peer-reviewed, independently verified, margin of error under 8%. Their findings, published in peer-reviewed journals and cited by NatureScot in its 2022 national strategy, documented a 60% reduction in peak flood discharge during the region's most severe winter storm events. Dr. Emma Thompson's team was not measuring sentiment. They were measuring cubic meters per second. The official position, before the evidence arrived, was reasonable. Reintroducing a functionally extinct species into a modern agricultural landscape represented an unknown variable, a cautious experiment requiring strict buffer zones, controlled population ceilings, and the understood possibility of lethal management if the animals caused measurable economic harm. The Scottish Government's 2008 licence reflected that caution: monitored, bounded, reversible. Every protocol is satisfied, every contingency planned for. There was only one thing the planners had not anticipated. The beavers ignored the buffer zones immediately, and within weeks had begun restructuring water systems the models said were too degraded to recover. And what the instruments recorded next would force a renegotiation not just of Scotland's rewilding policy, but of the fundamental assumption that large-scale ecological restoration requires human direction to succeed. Now here's what you need to understand about what 11 beavers actually do when they are placed in a river system that has forgotten them. They do not explore cautiously. They do not test the water and wait for conditions to improve. Within 72 hours of release, the first pair at Loch Dub had begun falling. Camera traps positioned by NatureScot's field teams captured it on the first night, a single animal working a stand of alder at the waterline, moving with the systematic precision of something that has not forgotten its purpose despite 4 centuries of absence. By the end of the first month, the team monitoring Loch Coilbar recorded a structure spanning 4 meters across a secondary channel, built from locally sourced timber, packed with clay and vegetation, and functionally watertight. The trickle feeding that channel had become a pond, measurably, photographically, documentably. What the hydrological models had predicted would take a managed restoration program 3 to 5 years to achieve. 11 animals had begun in a single season. The numbers stunned even the experts. If this is reshaping what you thought you knew about nature's power, hit subscribe. This channel goes deep on stories like this, the ones that challenge the official narrative with actual evidence. Now, back to Knapdale, because what the University of Exeter's instruments recorded next is the reason this story has never fully been told. But the evidence didn't stop there. It accelerated. When Dr. Emma Thompson's team at the University of Exeter published their hydrological analysis of the Knapdale catchment, the finding that drew the most attention was also the simplest to state. During the winter storm events of 2012 and 2013, events severe enough to flood downstream agricultural land in previous years, the beaver dam networks reduced peak flood discharge by 60%, not 5%, not 15, 60. And the instruments recorded something else, a 2.5 to 3 hour delay in flood peaks reaching downstream communities, 3 hours in which emergency services can be deployed, 3 hours in which residents can move possessions to higher ground, 3 hours that no concrete flood barrier installed in the same catchment had ever reliably delivered. When a hydrologist with peer-reviewed flood modeling credentials states that a network of animal-built structures outperformed engineered infrastructure, That is not a rewilding talking point. That is a documented finding that carries direct implications for every flood risk community in Britain. If you've made it this far, you already know this channel doesn't look away from the facts. Subscribe to join an audience that demands real proof, not just mainstream talking points. Now, back to Knapdale, because the flood data, extraordinary as it is, was only the surface of what the research was revealing. Because the dams were not just slowing water, they were cleaning it. According to the University of Exeter's water chemistry sampling, the beaver ponds were functioning as passive filtration systems, trapping suspended sediment, capturing agricultural runoff, and measurably reducing nitrate concentrations by 12% and phosphate levels by 8% across monitored sites. The mechanism is straightforward. Slower water drops its load. Nutrients that would otherwise reach open waterways and trigger algal blooms were being intercepted by structures built, maintained, and expanded by animals operating entirely on instinct. But the changes ran deeper than what could be seen from the banks. The biological transformation was not gradual, it was cascading. As the beaver ponds matured and the wetland margins expanded, NatureScot's biodiversity monitoring teams began recording changes that had no precedent in the Knapdale baseline data. Water vole populations, a species in catastrophic decline across mainland Britain, having lost over 90% of its range in the preceding 3 decades, quadrupled within the monitored zones. Invertebrate richness across the beaver-modified sites jumped by 80%. Otters, largely absent from the Knapdale channels before 2009, were recorded on camera traps with increasing regularity by 2014. The ponds had become architecture for an entire community of species, not just one. The beavers had not simply returned to the ecosystem. They had rebuilt the conditions that allowed dozens of other species to return with them. Think about that. 11 animals, 80% increase in invertebrate richness, no human intervention beyond releasing the crates. But the story at this point took an unexpected turn. Because the same hydrological changes that were rebuilding invertebrate communities were also restructuring salmon migration corridors. Some dams, particularly those built across narrower channels, were creating partial barriers to upstream spawning movement, and Scotland's Atlantic salmon fisheries, already under severe pressure from climate and sea lice, were not positioned to absorb additional obstacles without consequence. According to Scottish Government impact assessments, beaver-related fisheries incidents were being managed at an average cost of £1,180 per event. The rewilding miracle had an invoice attached. Drop your thoughts on the salmon debate in the comments. We read every single one. And if this showed you a side of rewilding you've never encountered before, hit the like button. Now, back to Scotland, because what was happening in the rivers of the Tay catchment at exactly this moment makes everything we've discussed so far look like a controlled experiment, because it was about to become anything but. Here's where it gets truly impossible to ignore. While the Scottish Government was carefully monitoring 11 beavers in Knapdale, debating buffer zones, managing salmon incidents, and logging every GPS coordinate, an entirely separate population had already been living in the Tay catchment for years. No license, no quarantine, no government oversight. The origin of these animals remains formally unresolved, though the prevailing assessment among wildlife managers is that they were released or escaped from private collections sometime in the early 2000s. Nobody counted them as they arrived. Nobody was watching when they started building. By the time NatureScot's 2024 national survey was completed, that unmanaged, unlicensed, entirely unsanctioned population had grown to over 2,000 animals across the Tay catchment alone. From 11 crates opened under strict government supervision to 2,000 animals rewriting the hydrology of lowland Perthshire without asking permission from a single agency, committee, or ministerial review panel. They are not waiting for permission. They are rewriting the rules. The institutions didn't see this coming. Turn on notifications so you don't miss our next deep dive into the stories the establishment tries to ignore. Because what Scotland's government chose to do next, faced with an ecological reality it had neither planned for nor authorized, is where this story moves from extraordinary to genuinely consequential. Step back from the specific numbers for a moment, from the 60%, the 80%, the 2,000 animals, the 3-hour delay, and look at the shape of what this evidence describes. A species absent for 400 years was returned to a landscape that had been written off. Within weeks, it began doing what no funded government program had managed to do. Within years, the instruments confirmed it. Within a decade, the population had expanded beyond any boundary the planners had drawn, and the government that had debated its reintroduction for 13 years before issuing a single license was forced to draft a strategy that runs to 2045. Not because the experiment failed, because it succeeded beyond the boundaries of the experiment itself. 60% reduction in peak flood discharge, 3 hours of additional warning time for downstream communities, nitrates down 12%, phosphates down 8%, water voles quadrupled, invertebrate richness up 80%, 2,000 animals in a catchment nobody was formally monitoring. A national strategy written in response to a reality that arrived uninvited. Every one of those numbers is documented. Every one of them was produced by a landscape that we had classified as too degraded to recover before we returned the animal that built it in the first place. The question is no longer whether beavers belong in Scotland. 2,000 animals in the Tay catchment settled that question without asking anyone's permission. The question is what it means that we spent 400 years, 4 centuries of drainage schemes, flood defense budgets, agricultural subsidies, and ecological management programs, failing to achieve what a breeding population of semi-aquatic rodents accomplishes as a matter of routine. If the rivers were dying only because we removed the creatures that kept them alive, then the history of British land management is not a history of stewardship. It is a history of an absence we created and then forgot we had created. What we choose to do with the next decade, whether we expand the beaver's range deliberately, manage its growth cautiously, or allow our institutional instinct for control to override the evidence, will determine the ecological trajectory of every river system in Britain. That is not an exaggeration. That is what the data says. If this changes how you see rewilding, subscribe and share this with someone who needs to see it. Drop your thoughts in the comments. We read every one. 11 crates were carried into Knapdale Forest on May 28, 2009. The rivers have not been the same since. The question is whether we are finally ready to follow where they lead.